No, grazie, lo so che la prima presentazione dopo pranzo non è facile, è un po' tosto ma la facciamo. I'll switch to English because, well, this is an international conference and I do usually speak English. I can't touch this. Can't touch this. It's a talk about authorization or access control. And you might be thinking, silly, silly Sam, that's stuff we do in our APIs, that's stuff we do in our backends. And you're right, that's stuff that we usually do on our APIs and backends, but you can also do certain parts of it in the front end, and I'm pretty sure that most of us here are building quite complex applications that deal with a backend or an API, right? Who builds an application that has an API? Whose API has some kind of authorization built in? All right, nice. This means that this is applicable to most, if not all of us in the room. Cool. So, who am I? My name is Sam Bellen. I'm a developer advocate at Auth0. If you've never heard of Auth0 before, we're basically identity as a service. So we try to make identity, authentication, authorization as easy as possible for all developers out there so you can focus on building your actual applications. I'm a Google developer expert, and you can find me on the internet as @sambego. I'm a developer, I'm a JavaScript developer, so it only makes sense that I'm also npm installable. If you run npx @sambego about me, download half of the internet and wait a few seconds, you'll find all the links to my social media and my presentations, my slides, straight into your terminal. So give it a shot. Cool. If you'd like to follow along with these slides right now or later, they are available at ac.sambego.tech. I'll share this link again later, and they're also at the bottom of the slides. But this is what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to look at attribute-based access control, move onwards to role-based access control, and I think I might have switched them, I'm not sure anymore. And lastly, we'll look into relationship-based access control with a live demo, if all the demo gods are with me today. But before we dive into these different approaches to access control to authorization, I'd first like to clarify the difference between authentication and authorization, because they're two sides of the same coin, but they're not exactly the same thing. Authentication is the process of verifying that somebody is who they say they are. That's usually when you enter a username and password in a website or an application. It's us verifying that you are who you say you are based on that username and password. That's authentication. Authorization, on the other hand, is the art of regulating who can do what on your system. And I call it art because it's not as straightforward as it looks. Every application is different. Every application deals with different permissions or actions or resources that users can interact with. So it's kind of finding out what is the best solution for your own application. Cool. Let's look at the first approach, RBAC, also known as role-based access control, and it's a little bit in the name. We are going to use roles to define who can do what on our systems. And in RBAC, a user has one or more roles. Straightforward, a user can be a guest, a user can be an admin, a user can be any role that you have defined within your systems. And these roles, like I said, admin, engineer, guest, whatever makes sense to you. But a role is usually just a collection of permissions. So you group multiple permissions, multiple actions that a user can take on certain resources in your applications, and you group them as a role, and then you can assign those roles, one or more, to your existing users. And these permissions can be, they can read a certain resource, they can write to a certain resource, or they can delete, or any other action that makes sense for you. So if we look at a few examples, a guest is able to read all documentation, where guest is a role, and that role contains one permission, and it is read all of the documentation. Whereas an engineer can read and write all documentation. Again, engineer is the role, but now they have two permissions, read and write. And lastly, an admin is able to read, write, and delete all documentation. So again, the admin is the role, and the three permissions that are assigned to that admin role are read, edit, and delete. So again, with RBAC, you're dealing with roles, which are basically just a collection of permissions. But what about RBAC in Angular? Because, well, this is an Angular conference, I have to talk about Angular. And usually, you check any access control, any authorization on your APIs. You should always check it because, as we all know, Angular applications are front-end applications. Anybody can change some code in their DevTools and try to circumvent certain protection measures you have in place. But you can still do or use RBAC in your front-end systems in Angular if, for example, you want to show certain pages to certain users and not for others. There's a few approaches. The most common approach that I see these days is to include permissions or roles. I'd like to suggest permissions within your ID token, which is a token you get back when your user logs in using OpenID Connect, which is a token-based authentication and authorization protocol. But if you look at all of it, it contains a bunch of information about the user, their name, their given name, things like that. But it can also contain the permissions that your user has assigned to them. So this means that we can show certain parts of our application based on the permissions that we find in that ID token as soon as a user logs in. Cool. That was a very short introduction to RBAC. Let's move on to ABAC. And ABAC stands for Attribute-Based Access Control, also sometimes known as Policy-Based Access Control. So whenever you hear ABAC, Attribute-Based Access Control, or Policy-Based Access Control, they're more or less the exact same thing. And with attribute-based access control, we're not going to deal with permissions and roles. We're going to decide whether or not a user can interact with a certain resource based on one or more attributes. And there's a few categories within these attributes. You have user attributes, environment, resource, and action. Now, user attributes are things like a role. So sometimes you can use RBAC in combination with ABAC. One does not mean that if you use one, doesn't mean that you cannot use the other. Depends on your own setup, your own architecture. But other user attributes are which organization is this user a part of, which security clearance do they have, which language or country are they from, things like that. And environment attributes are things like, what's the time of the day? Should this user be allowed to log in the middle of the night, for example? Where is the location of the data? Is the data stored in Italy? Should my American colleagues have access to Italian data? Yes or no? And current threat level. Are we currently under attack by hackers? If so, maybe we want to lock down our systems a little bit more and temporarily stop people from doing certain actions on certain resources. Resources attributes are things that are related to the actual thing we're trying to interact with. So when was this document created? Who owns this folder? Does this resource contain the sensitive data? And based on those attributes, you can also decide, yes or no, this action is currently permitted by this user. And lastly, the action attributes are the attributes that are related to the actual action we're trying to do. Are we trying to read something? Are we trying to write something? Are we trying to delete something? And so forth. So, look at a few examples again. Any engineer can write to any file if we're currently not experiencing a DDoS attack, where any engineer would be the role of the user. So a user attribute. Write is the action. Any file is the resource. And not experiencing a DDoS attack is something that is related to the environment of the action happening at that time. Any accountant can upload an invoice if it's during their working hours. Again, an accountant is something that is related to the user. It's their job, it's their role. Upload is the action. An invoice is something related to the resource we're trying to interact with. And during their working hours is something that's related to the environment, the time of day that we're trying to do this action. And lastly, an HR representative can look up personal details if the subject is part of their local branch. So again, HR representative is something related to their user. Lookup is the action. Personal details is a resource. And is not part of your local branch, is related to the environment. You don't always have to mix and match all four of these attributes, but by combining these, you can create very fine-grained and very strong policies and lock down your systems as much as possible, depending on how much you want to do that. So ABAC, Attribute-Based Access Control, allows for a very fine-grained control over all possible actions because you can mix and match all these different kinds of attributes and choose how many you'd like to check for. But we have to build out all of these policies by hand, which means that you have to figure out all of these situations, all of the use cases, all of the scenarios that can happen, and you have to build those policies and then decide yes or no, this action can happen, yes or no, this user can do this. So it's very fine-grained, but it also takes a lot of time for us to build and maintain attribute-based access control policies. Lastly, let's look at RBAC. RBAC stands for Relationship-Based Access Control, which is a newer approach to access control. It's a bit more complicated than RBAC and ABAC, but it's also much more powerful. And with RBAC, permissions for a resource are defined by the user's relationship to that resource. So we're going to look at what the relationship a user has to a specific resource. For example, which relationship do I have to the slide deck that I'm currently showing? Which relationship do I have to the slide deck that Fabienne is going to show after me? We're going to look at specific relationships between specific users and specific resources. So users are connected to objects through relationships. These are the three words you have to remember when working with Rebag. You have users, and they're not always going to be literal users, but something that is a user in Rebag is something that has a relationship with an object, and that relationship is, of course, the thing that we're looking for with Rebag. So a user can be any sort of thing. Like I said, it doesn't have to be a literal user. It can also be a group. A group can be a collection of users, but you can also assign relationships to a whole group. For example, everybody in this room is able to see my presentation while you're here, but I just assigned you all that permission. An organization, an application user, a folder, all those kind of things can be a user within Rebag. And an object is any resource that our application deals with, like with any of the other access control approaches. So a relationship is how a particular user is connected to an object. That's basically what we're looking for. How is a particular user related to a particular object? For example, Sam is the owner of this slide deck. I am the owner. I made this slide deck. So Sam in this scenario is going to be the user. The owner is the relationship, and the slide deck is the object. I am related to this object, the slide deck, as the owner. But a resource can also be a user in one relationship, but an object in another. And this is where Rebag becomes very powerful, but also quite a bit confusing at first, because depending on the scenario, depending on the relationship, something can be a user, and in another relationship, they can be an object. But if we look at some examples, well, there are direct and indirect relationships, but I'll get back to that in a minute. But if we look at the direct relationship, for example, Sam is an editor of this slide deck. I am an editor of the slide deck because I created it, because I assigned myself this role. It's a direct relationship. I created this slide deck. I own this. I can edit this. So Sam is the user, relationship is the editor, and the object is the slide deck. But indirect relationships is what makes Rebag really, really strong. These are relationships that we don't specifically define. We're not going to tell our authorization system, hey, all of these relationships exist. The authorization system is just going to figure this out based on some data that has been provided to it. So if we look at another example, Sam, me, I am a member of Auth0. I work of Auth0. So in this example, I am still a user that is related to Auth0 as a member. But everybody in Auth0 can view all of the slide decks within our organization. And you'll notice that Auth0 was an object in the first example, but became a user in the second. So Sam is a member of the object user, and the user Auth0 is a viewer of all slide decks within our organization. But I never specifically said Sam can view all slide decks within our organization. I only said everybody in Auth0 can view all slide decks. So if I add all of you to the Auth0 organization, you should magically all be able to see all slide decks, even though I never specifically added you all as viewers of the slide decks. And this is what we call an indirect relationship within Rebag. These are the relationships that we can infer, that we can figure out based on other existing direct relationships. So if we look at a few more examples, just to try to clarify this, Sam, I am a user. I am related to the folder as a owner. And like I said, the folder is an owner. But that folder can then also become a user. So the folder becomes a user. And it's related as an owner to all slide decks in this folder. And Sam is indirectly related to all slide decks in that folder because Sam is the owner of that folder. No need for me to tell me that I can view or edit or own all the files in a folder that I already own because I own that folder. And this is really cool, but I'd like to show you this in action. But before I show you this in action, I'd like to mention one thing, and there's an open source project that helps you deal with OpenFGA, is what we call it, with relationship-based access control. It's built by us. I'm not going to make any promotional thingy about this, but if you're interested, there's OpenFGA. You can download it. It's all on GitHub, and you can see it in action. So I'm going to use this for the demo. So let's get started. I have an API here, which has a few endpoints. It basically allows me to create documents and to create folders and view those documents and folders. So if I start by creating a folder, you'll notice that I have a bearer token, which is my bearer token, so we know that it's me that is creating this folder. And if I do so, I'll get a 200 status because, well, that was a success. That should not give a 200, that should also give a an ID, but let me see if I have internet. I do not. Let's try this again. Cool. I am roaming, so it's a bit slow, but I'm going through my cell phone. But I now was able to create a document with the ID that we just see here. And if I copy this, we can use this in the next example. So now if I want to see that document, I should be able to see that document because, well, I created that document. So let me change the ID in this endpoint and send this. And wait a few seconds. But if all goes well, I should be able to see this document. Let me put my phone closer to the laptop. Maybe that helps. But I should be able to see this document because, well, I am the one that created this, this document. But it's taking a long time. So if you want to have a pro tip from me, don't rely on internet doing demos when you're on a stage. So let's cancel this and try this again. Yes, but the Wi-Fi didn't work earlier. That's why I'm roaming. I did have a response, so my log does show me something, but something goes wrong, which means that I'm trying to check with an online service whether or not this relationship is it exists. It should tell me, yes, this works because, well, I am the one that created this. But let's move on and see if we can see some of the rest of this demo. Now, if my colleague Anna would like to see this document, she's not the one that created this, so she should be getting an error saying, well, hey, you're not allowed because this is not your document. So paste in that ID, and you'll see that instead of using my own bearer token, I use Anna's. So I know that it's Anna that's trying to see this document. And if I click on this, we get a 401. And that worked, because Anna did not create this document. She's not related to this document at all. She should not be able to see this document. Cool. I can now decide to share this document with Anna because I want her to see this document because we're both trying to work on this slide deck. So I'm going to say, I want to share this document. So I paste in the ID. I'm going to assign the viewer role to Anna. And if I do so, I get a 200. OK. So next up, if I try to get this document as Anna again, I should not get an error message, but I should just be able to see the document. And there we go. That did not work. I did, sorry? That was an F. There you go. Thank you. So let's try that again. Paste it in. Get an OK. And now let's try to get it as Anna because we just shared it with her. And there we go. We did get the document because I just shared it with Anna. And this is all straightforward because I'm assigning direct relationships. I assigned the owner relationships because I created this. I assigned the viewer relationship to Anna because, well, I shared it with her. But if I now create a folder with my own user, again, I should get the folder ID, which worked. So let's copy that. And if I try to get that folder, paste that ID, I should get the folder back. Hooray, that worked because I am the owner. Now, if my other colleague, Corey, tries to see this folder, again, I guess you'll be able to tell what's supposed to happen. He did not create this folder. He has not been assigned to that folder. So he should not be able to see this. OK, cool. So now let's move that document that we created earlier within that folder that is owned by me and by me only. So I'm going to say, let's use the folder with this ID that we just created. And the document ID, I'll copy again from here. But basically, I'm going to say, let's assign a parent relationship to this document, and the parent of that document is going to be this folder. Again, 200. Now, if I share that folder with Corey, let me copy that again. he should be able to see all the contents of that folder, even though I never really specifically shared the document that's inside of the folder with Corey. I just shared that folder. So let's get 2 more tests going. We'll just see if he can get the folder now, which he should be because I just shared it with him. So 200, we got a folder, and let's copy that document ID one more time. And if he now tries to see that document, he should be able to see that document because he's related to that document as the viewer of its parent of the folder where the document is in. So there we go. He saw the document. So almost everything in the demo worked except that one call, but that was not really that bad. So what we should take away from this is that with Rebag, you don't have to assign direct relationships. The system will be able to figure out relationships that are there if it has enough data to figure it out. So if you'd like to play with this, there's a playground called play.fga.dev, which I think looks something like this. No, I don't have it open, but basically it allows you to play around with the OpenFGA system and see if it works for you. So what is the difference between RBAC and Rebag? Because they only have one letter in difference, but there is a very big big difference between RBAC and Rebag. RBAC defines permissions and roles and are typically valid for all resources of a certain resource. I am an admin, so I can delete all posts. I can write new posts, but I am not really related to a specific post, a specific resource, because that would mean you would have 1 million permissions if you have a very big system. With Rebag, on the other hand, you are related to specific resources, to specific posts, to specific documents, to specific whatever you deal with in your application. So an admin can only delete posts that are assigned to them. He can only delete specific posts, not all of them. Rebag is much more fine-grained than RBAC. It's a much more fine-grained approach to authorization. But unlike ABAC, where we have to define all of those policies ourselves, with Rebag, there's a lot of relationships that are inferred, that are indirect, that we don't have to define ourselves, as long as we have a decent set of data for the system to figure out which relationships should exist. So let's recap. Rebag uses permissions and roles. A role is just a collection of permissions, and we use those permissions to figure out whether or not a user can do a certain action. ABAC checks for a combination of different attributes, user, environment, action, and resource attributes. You can mix and match them, but you have to build out all of those policies yourself, so it's a lot of work to build and maintain. Rebag looks at relationships between certain users and objects, and something can be a user in one scenario and an object in another. And if you'd like to know more, again, fga.dev has some more information, play.fga.dev, openfga.dev, Salzburg Academy, but all the links are in this slide, and you'll find the slides at this link. So having that said that, grazie, thank you very much.